My wedding. My fiancé's family ridiculed my mother in front of everyone. One of them said, "She doesn't belong here." They laughed. I stood up, stopped the ceremony, and walked away. The next day, everything changed. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. John Calder stood at the edge of the reception hall, watching his mother smooth the fabric of her navy dress for the third time in as many minutes. The gesture was small, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know her, but John recognized it immediately. The nervous tell of a woman who'd spent her entire life making sure she looked presentable on a budget that rarely allowed for it. The renovated lakeside lodge near Alum Creek was beautiful in its simplicity. Exposed wooden beams crossed overhead, and through the wall of windows behind the head table, the water caught the late afternoon sun in fractured gold. John had chosen this place specifically because it felt honest. No marble columns, no chandeliers dripping with crystal, just clean lines and natural light, the kind of space that didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He'd paid for all of it himself. Every deposit, every vendor invoice, every negotiation with the caterer who tried to upsell him on premium liquor packages he didn't need. Kendra had wanted something bigger, something in the city with valet parking and a string quartet, but John had held firm. This was his wedding too, and he wasn't starting his marriage drowning in debt to impress people he barely knew. His mother, Janice Calder, sat alone at a table near the back. She'd arrived an hour early, as she always did for important events, and had helped the venue staff arrange centerpieces even though no one had asked her to. That was who she was, a woman who filled empty spaces with usefulness because she'd learned early that being helpful meant being valued. John remembered the night she'd shown him the dress, 2 weeks before the wedding. She'd hung it on the back of her bedroom door and stood there with her arms crossed, studying it like it might transform into something more expensive if she looked at it long enough. It was on clearance at Macy's, she'd said. I took it to that tailor on Broad Street, the one you recommended. He did a good job with the hem. John had looked at the dress, simple, elegant, a deep navy that would photograph well, and felt something tighten in his chest. "It's perfect, Mom." She'd smiled then, that small, private smile she reserved for moments when she was proud of herself, but didn't want to make a fuss about it. "I want to look nice for your day." Now, watching her sit alone while Kendra's relatives formed a tight cluster 3 tables away, John felt that same tightness return. But it wasn't pride this time. It was something darker, something that tasted like copper on his tongue. Kendra's family had arrived in a caravan of matching luxury SUVs, all dark paint and chrome trim, parking in a row near the entrance like they were establishing territory. Her father, Robert Whitlow, had shaken John's hand with the firm grip of a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms and country clubs, his smile polished and empty. Her mother, Patricia, had air-kissed John's cheeks and immediately begun rearranging the seating chart, moving nameplates with manicured fingers as though the venue coordinator had made some sort of amateur mistake. They'd barely acknowledged Janice when she'd introduced herself. Robert had offered a curt nod. Patricia had glanced at Janice's dress, taking in the discount store fabric and the self-tailored hem, and her smile had thinned into something that wasn't quite a smile at all. "How lovely," Patricia had said, the words weighted with meanings John couldn't quite parse but felt in his gut. Janice had straightened her shoulders and thanked her anyway. John had grown up in Millstone, Ohio, a town small enough that everyone knew your business and remembered your mistakes long after you'd moved past them. His father had died when John was 14, a highway accident on Route 23, a patch of black ice, and a semi-truck that hadn't seen him in time. After that, it had been just John and his mother in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town, where the houses leaned slightly toward each other and the street had more potholes than asphalt. Janice had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Days at Millstone Meadows Nursing Home, where she helped elderly residents bathe and dress and remember the names of children who'd stopped visiting. Nights cleaning offices downtown, vacuuming corporate carpets, and emptying trash bins while the rest of the town slept. She'd never missed a parent-teacher conference, never forgotten a permission slip, never asked anyone for help, even when the electricity bill came due and the cupboards were nearly empty. Respect is earned quietly, she told John once, when he was 16 and angry about the whispers he'd heard at school. Whispers about the scholarship kid whose mother cleaned toilets for a living. People can take a lot of things from you. They can't take your dignity unless you hand it to them. John had carried that lesson into adulthood. Through college, where he'd worked campus security on weekends to pay for textbooks. Through his first job in finance, where he'd put in 80-hour weeks to prove he belonged in rooms full of people who'd never had to check their bank balance before making a purchase. Through his relationship with Kendra Whitlow, who'd walked into that Columbus finance conference 3 years ago wearing a designer suit and the kind of confidence that came from never having to wonder if you were good enough. She'd been magnetic, sharp-witted during the panel discussions, charming during the networking mixers, and when she'd approached John at the hotel bar afterward, he felt like he'd been chosen for something he'd spent his whole life trying to reach. Their relationship had moved fast. Dinners at restaurants where the menu didn't list prices. Weekend trips to Chicago and Nashville. Introductions to her family at their home in the gated suburb near Westerville, where the lawns were professionally maintained and the neighbors competed over Christmas light displays. Robert and Patricia had tolerated John. That was the word that fit best. They'd invited him to holiday dinners and asked polite questions about his work, but there was always a distance in their eyes, a calculation happening behind their smiles. They'd wanted better for Kendra, someone with the right last name, the right alma mater, the right family connections. John was presentable enough, successful enough, but he'd come from the wrong side of a town they'd never heard of, and that stain didn't wash off easily. The wedding ceremony had gone smoothly. The officiant, a friend of Kendra's family who'd done dozens of these, had guided them through the vows with practiced ease. Kendra had looked beautiful in her white gown, her hair swept up in an intricate style that had taken 3 hours at a salon John couldn't pronounce. When she'd said, "I do," her voice had been steady, confident, and John had felt a brief flicker of relief. Maybe this would work. Maybe they could build something real. The reception had started well enough. Champagne toasts. The first dance. Kendra's father had given a speech about family and tradition and the importance of finding someone who challenged you to be better, though John had noticed he'd never quite made eye contact during the part about John himself. But then the reception progressed, and the champagne kept flowing, and the relatives who'd been polite during the ceremony started to relax in ways that revealed their true thoughts. John had been standing near the bar, waiting for the bartender to refill his glass of water, when he'd heard the voices. They'd been loud enough to carry over the music. Just barely, but enough. Some people should know their place. That was Kendra's aunt, a woman named Diane who'd had 3 glasses of wine by John's count and was working on her 4th. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who thought they were being discreet, but had lost the ability to modulate volume. "This is embarrassing." Someone had laughed. A sharp, mean sound that cut through the ambient noise of clinking glasses and polite conversation. Another voice, this one belonging to Kendra's cousin. "She doesn't fit in with this family. I mean, look at her. It's like she wandered in from a church basement potluck." John had turned, slowly, his water glass forgotten on the bar. His mother sat 3 tables away, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was staring at her plate, at the half-eaten salmon and untouched risotto, and her face was carefully neutral, the way it got when she was absorbing hurt and refusing to show it. John's gaze swept the room until he found Kendra. She was standing less than 10 feet from her aunt, wearing her white dress and her professional smile, talking to a group of friends from college. She'd heard. John could see it in the fractional pause in her conversation, the way her eyes had flickered toward her aunt and then away again, like she was deciding whether or not to acknowledge what had just been said. She decided not to. She kept talking, kept smiling, kept playing the role of the happy bride while her family mocked the woman who'd raised John from childhood. John set his water glass on the bar. He didn't slam it. He placed it down with deliberate care, the way his mother had taught him to handle fragile things. Then he walked toward the center of the reception hall, his footsteps steady on the polished wood. The DJ was transitioning between songs, and in a brief silence, John's voice carried. "This wedding is over. The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. Kendra turned, her smile faltering. "John? What?" "We're done," he said. His voice was calm, clear, the voice of a man who'd made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. "The ceremony's over. The marriage is over. Everyone can go home." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Patricia Whitlow stood, her hand pressed to her chest like she'd been physically struck. Robert's face darkened, his jaw working as he tried to process what he was hearing. John didn't explain. He didn't point fingers or make accusations. He simply walked to the back of the room, to the table where his mother sat, and extended his hand. "Mom, let's go." Janice looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "John, honey, we can't just—" "Yes," he said quietly, "we can." She took his hand. He helped her stand, and together they walked toward the exit. Behind them, the room erupted into noise. Questions, protests, Kendra's voice rising above the others, calling his name. John didn't look back. He kept walking, his mother's hand in his, until they pushed through the double doors and stepped into the parking lot. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and lake water. The sun had dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. John's car was parked near the edge of the lot, a modest sedan that he'd paid off 2 years ago. He opened the passenger door for his mother and waited until she was settled before walking around to the driver's side. Inside the car, silence stretched between them. Janice stared at her hands, folded in her lap, the same way they'd been folded at the table. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. John started the engine. "Yes, I did. They're going to say terrible things about you. Let them." He pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the lodge and the wedding and Kendra Whitlow behind. In his rearview mirror, he could see people spilling out of the venue, their silhouettes dark against the lit windows. Someone was shouting. Someone else was on their phone. John kept driving. That night, in the quiet of his apartment, John sat at his kitchen table and stared at his phone. The messages had started within an hour of leaving the venue. Texts from Kendra, first confused, then apologetic, then angry. Voicemails from her mother, demanding explanations. Emails from relatives he'd met once, telling him he'd embarrassed the family, humiliated Kendra, ruined everything. He deleted them all without responding. At 2 a.m, a final text came through from Kendra. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. Please." John typed back a single sentence. "The marriage is annulled. I'll handle the paperwork." Then he turned off his phone and went to bed. By the next evening, the tone had shifted. Kendra called from an unknown number, and John answered out of morbid curiosity. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "In front of everyone I know, in front of my entire family. Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand exactly what I've done," John said. "My lawyer says you owe me. For the deposits, for the emotional distress, for—" John ended the call. That's when he understood. Not just who Kendra was, but who she'd always been. The polished exterior, the charm, the way she'd introduced him to her world of expensive restaurants and gated communities. It had all been performance, a carefully constructed image designed to get her what she wanted. And when he'd refused to play along, when he'd chosen his mother over her family's approval, the mask had cracked. John reopened his laptop and started a new document. He titled it Timeline and began writing down everything he could remember. Dates, conversations, the names of vendors he'd contacted, the receipts he'd saved, the emails he'd exchanged with Kendra about wedding plans. He had a feeling he was going to need them. 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, the lawsuit arrived. John had been at work when the process server found him, emerging from the elevator on the 14th floor of the office building where John managed investment portfolios for mid-sized companies. The man had been polite, professional, handing over the manila envelope with an apologetic expression that suggested he'd done this enough times to know what the paperwork inside represented. John called her. "That's me. You've been served. Have a good day." John had waited until he was back in his office before opening the envelope. Inside, 43 pages of legal language outlined Kendra Whitlow's civil suit against him. She was claiming emotional distress, reputational harm, and financial damages tied to the canceled wedding. Her lawyer had itemized everything: the venue deposit she claimed to have contributed to, the cost of her dress, the emotional toll of public humiliation, even the theoretical lost wages from having to take time off work to recover from the trauma. The filing painted John as a cruel, calculating man who'd abandoned his bride at the altar without cause, leaving her devastated and financially ruined. It made no mention of the insults hurled at his mother. No mention of Kendra's silence when her family had mocked the woman who'd raised him. The narrative was clean, simple, and designed to make her look like the victim of a heartless man's whim. John read through the entire document twice, his coffee going cold on his desk. Then he picked up his phone and called an attorney. David Brennan specialized in family law and civil disputes. He'd been recommended by a colleague, a quiet man who'd gone through a messy divorce and had come out the other side relatively intact. David's office was in a converted house in the short north, the kind of place with creaking floorboards and bookshelves that smelled like old paper and leather. When John explained the situation, David had leaned back in his chair and tinted his fingers beneath his chin. "She's going for a settlement," David said. "This isn't about winning in court. She wants you to panic, write her a check, and make the problem go away." "I'm not giving her anything," John said. David nodded slowly. "Then we build a defense. Tell me everything. And I mean everything. Emails, texts, recorded conversations. Anything that contradicts her version of events." John had started talking. He'd told David about the wedding, about the insults, about Kendra's silence. He'd explained how he'd paid for nearly everything himself, how the contracts and receipts were all in his name. And then he'd mentioned the messages. "What messages?" David had asked. "Texts," John said, "from before the wedding. Kendra used to complain about my mother, about how she talked, how she dressed. She'd send them to her friends, to her sister. I saw some of them on her phone once when she left it unlocked." David had sat forward. "Do you have copies?" "Not yet, but I know they exist. Then we need to get them. Legally. Through discovery, if necessary. If she's painting herself as the victim and you have evidence that she was disparaging your family before this happened, it changes the entire narrative." Over the following weeks, John began the slow process of documentation. He pulled bank statements showing every payment he'd made for the wedding. He requested copies of contracts from vendors, all signed in his name. He dug through his own phone, finding screenshots he'd taken months ago, screenshots of Kendra's text that he'd saved on instinct, some part of him recognizing even then that her words about his mother weren't just casual complaints, but reflections of something deeper. One screenshot showed a conversation between Kendra and her sister. "Kendra, his mom is coming to the dress fitting. Kill me now. Sister, why is she even involved? It's not her wedding. Kendra, I wish his mom wouldn't show up. She ruins everything." Another showed Kendra texting a college friend. "Kendra, dinner with his mom tonight. Pray for me." The woman orders the cheapest thing on the menu and then wants to split the check. It's mortifying. And another, sent to her cousin. "Kendra, why does she have to talk about her nursing home job at every family event? Nobody cares about bedpans and dementia patients." Read the room. John stared at the messages, his jaw tight. He'd known Kendra had been uncomfortable around his mother. He'd sensed the tension, the way Kendra would steer conversations away from topics his mother brought up, the way she'd always found an excuse to cut visits short. But seeing it spelled out in stark text, the disdain, the embarrassment, the casual cruelty, made something harden inside him. David had filed a response to Kendra's lawsuit, denying all claims and requesting the case go to mediation before trial. The mediation had been scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room downtown, neutral territory chosen by the court-appointed mediator. John arrived early, wearing a suit he'd bought for job interviews years ago. David met him in the building's lobby, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a few legal wars. "Remember," David said as they rode the elevator up, "stay calm. Don't react emotionally. Let me do the talking unless they ask you a direct question." John nodded. The conference room was sterile. White walls, a long table, uncomfortable chairs. Kendra was already there when they entered, sitting beside her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Angela Russo who'd built a career on high-conflict family disputes. Kendra looked smaller than John remembered, her shoulders hunched, her hands twisting a tissue. She dressed carefully, a modest gray dress, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The image of a woman still recovering from trauma. When John walked in, she looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were red-rimmed, and she held his gaze just long enough to let him see her pain before looking away, as though the sight of him was too much to bear. The mediator, a tired-looking man in his 60s named Gerald, explained the process. Each side would present their version of events. They'd work toward a resolution that satisfied both parties. The goal was to avoid a costly trial. Angela Russo went first. She laid out Kendra's case with practiced efficiency. The emotional devastation of being abandoned, the public humiliation, the financial losses. She gestured to Kendra, who dabbed at her eyes with the tissue. "My client has suffered immensely," Angela said. She entered this marriage in good faith, planning a future with Mr. Calder. Instead, he ended things without warning, without explanation, leaving her to face the judgment of her community and family. She's asking for fair compensation for the harm he's caused. Gerald turned to John. "Mr. Calder, would you like to respond?" David cleared his throat. "We would, and we'd like to submit evidence that directly contradicts Ms. Whitlow's characterization of events." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed copies of the text messages, the ones Kendra had sent about John's mother. David slid them across the table to Gerald and Angela. The room went silent as they read. Kendra's face had gone pale. She leaned toward Angela, whispering urgently, but Angela held up a hand, her eyes still scanning the messages. David spoke into the silence. "My client didn't abandon Ms. Whitlow without cause. He ended the relationship after witnessing her family openly insult his mother during the wedding reception. Insults Ms. Whitlow heard and chose to ignore. Furthermore, as these messages show, Ms. Whitlow had been disparaging Mr. Calder's mother for months, expressing embarrassment over her background and livelihood. This isn't a case of a man acting cruelly. It's a case of a man setting a boundary when his family was disrespected." Gerald looked at Kendra, then at the messages, then back at Angela. "Ms. Russo, do you want to respond to this?" Angela's expression had shifted. The confident sharpness was gone, replaced by something more calculating. She glanced at Kendra, then at the mediator. "These messages lack context," Angela said, but her voice had lost its edge. "They were private complaints, the kind any couple might have." "They demonstrate a pattern," David interrupted. "A pattern of my client's fiancé harboring deep-seated contempt for his family, while simultaneously planning a wedding he largely paid for." He pulled out another set of documents, bank statements, receipts, vendor contracts. "As you'll see here, Mr. Calder covered the majority of wedding expenses. The venue, catering, photography, all in his name, all paid from his accounts. Ms. Whitlow contributed a fraction of what she's claiming in damages." Gerald studied the documents, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, his gaze lingered on Kendra. "Ms. Whitlow," he said carefully, "is there anything you'd like to add?" Kendra's hands had stopped twisting the tissue. She stared at the table, her jaw working, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean those things the way they sound." "Then how did you mean them?" Gerald asked. She didn't answer. The mediation ended without resolution. Angela had requested a recess to consult with her client, and Gerald had granted it. As John and David left the conference room, John caught one last glimpse of Kendra through the closing door. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the wall, her face blank, and for the first time since all of this had started, she looked less like a victim and more like someone who'd been caught in a lie they'd thought was foolproof. Outside, in the late afternoon sun, David turned to John. "That went better than I expected," he said. "They're going to push for a quick settlement now. They know they can't win if this goes to trial." "I'm not settling," John said. David hesitated. "John, even if you win, litigation is expensive. It's going to cost you time, money, stress. I don't care. She tried to destroy my reputation to cover up the fact that she and her family disrespected my mother. I'm not giving her a dime. David studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then we take this all the way. But Kendra didn't let it go quietly. If she couldn't win in the courtroom, she'd win in the court of public opinion. Within a week, her social media presence exploded. Photos from the wedding, carefully cropped to show her alone in her white dress, looking radiant and hopeful. Captions about heartbreak and betrayal. Long posts about the pain of loving someone who turned out to be someone else entirely. I thought I knew him, one post read. I thought we were building a life together. But when the moment came to stand beside me, he walked away. No explanation, no compassion, just gone. I don't know how to move forward from this kind of hurt. Comments poured in. Friends, acquaintances, strangers, all offering sympathy, condolences, outrage on her behalf. The narrative spread. John Calder, the heartless man who'd abandoned his bride. Kendra Whitlow, the woman who'd loved him despite everything and been destroyed for it. John watched it happen from a distance. His own social media had been quiet for years. A few photos from hiking trips, the occasional update about his mother's garden. He didn't post about the lawsuit, didn't respond to the accusations, didn't try to tell his side of the story. David had advised him to stay silent. Anything you say publicly can be used against you. Let her dig her own grave. So John waited. And then, something unexpected happened. Kendra's online crusade began to attract attention beyond her immediate circle. A local blogger who covered social justice issues picked up her story and wrote a piece titled "The Disposability of Women in Modern Relationships." It framed John as part of a broader pattern of men who discarded women when they became inconvenient. The post named John directly. It included his place of employment. It speculated about his character based entirely on Kendra's version of events. David had called John within an hour of the post going live. "This crosses a line," David said. "She's making defamatory statements that are provably false. We can file a counterclaim." "Will that make this worse?" John asked. "In the short term? Maybe. But in the long term, it protects you. She's weaponizing her platform to damage your reputation. That's actionable." John thought about his mother, sitting in her small living room, reading those posts on her old tablet. Thought about his co-workers, who'd started giving him odd looks in the break room. Thought about Kendra, spinning her story to anyone who'd listen, erasing the truth to preserve her image. "File it," John said. The counterclaim hit Kendra's lawsuit like a stone through glass. David had built the case methodically, pulling together not just the text messages and financial records, but also Kendra's public statements, screenshots of her social media posts, archived copies of the blog posts that had named John, timestamps showing how she'd ramped up her campaign as the litigation progressed. The counterclaim alleged defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. It wasn't just a defense anymore. It was an offensive strike. John hadn't expected the speed of the fallout. Within days of the counterclaim being filed, Kendra's employer took notice. She worked for a mid-sized firm in corporate compliance, the kind of role where reputation mattered. Companies hired compliance officers to avoid risk, to make sure their operations stayed clean and above scrutiny. Having an employee embroiled in a public legal battle involving allegations of defamation wasn't the kind of exposure they wanted. John heard about it secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who worked in the same industry. Kendra had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. The firm needed to assess whether her conduct, both the lawsuit and the public statements, reflected poorly on their brand. John felt no satisfaction hearing the news. He felt nothing, really, except a distant sense of inevitability. Actions had consequences. Kendra had built her case on lies and public shaming, and now the foundation was crumbling. A week later, she was let go. The news came through David, who'd received a call from Angela Russo requesting an emergency meeting. They met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, neutral ground again, and Angela had been blunt. "My client's situation has changed," she'd said. "She's no longer employed, and the legal fees are becoming untenable for her family. We'd like to discuss settlement terms." David had folded his hands on the table. "We've been clear from the beginning. Mr. Calder isn't interested in settling. Even now, when she's lost her job, when she's struggling, whose fault is that?" David had asked quietly. "My client didn't file the lawsuit. My client didn't go online and make false accusations. Ms. Whitlow created this situation. She can end it by dropping her claims and agreeing to a non-disparagement clause. Angela had left the meeting without agreeing to anything, but John could sense the shift. Kendra was running out of options. The next move came from Robert and Patricia Whitlow. They'd called John directly, bypassing the lawyers, and asked to meet in person. John had agreed, curious to see how Kendra's parents would handle the mess their daughter had created. They'd chosen a restaurant in Westerville, upscale but not ostentatious, the kind of place where business deals were closed over steak and scotch. Robert and Patricia were already seated when John arrived, their faces carefully composed. "Thank you for coming," Robert said, standing to shake John's hand. His grip was still firm, but there was something defeated in his eyes. They made small talk for a few minutes, safe topics like the weather and traffic, before Patricia finally cut to the point. "This needs to stop," she said. Her voice was tight, controlled, but underneath, John could hear the strain. "The legal bills are piling up. Kendra's reputation is in tatters. Our family is being dragged through the mud. We're asking you, as someone we once welcomed into our home, to drop this. For everyone's sake." John took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch. Then he set the glass down and met Patricia's gaze. "You're asking me to drop my counterclaim. And Kendra will drop hers," Robert said quickly. "We'll call it even." "Everyone walks away. Everyone walks away," John repeated. "Except I didn't start this. Your daughter sued me for ending a marriage after I watched your family insult my mother. She went online and lied about me. She tried to destroy my reputation because I wouldn't let her destroy my family. And now that it's backfired, you want me to let it go. For peace." Patricia's expression hardened. "You humiliated her in front of everyone. You walked out of that wedding without giving her a chance to explain. Explain what?" John interrupted. His voice stayed level, but there was steel beneath it. "That your sister thought my mother didn't know her place? That Kendra stood there and said nothing while you all mocked the woman who raised me? What exactly should she have explained?" The table went silent. Robert stared at his menu. Patricia's jaw worked, but no words came out. "I didn't start this," John said again. "I'm just finishing it." He stood, left cash on the table for his untouched drink, and walked out. By late autumn, Kendra's social media had gone dark. The posts about heartbreak and betrayal had been deleted, replaced by a generic profile picture and a locked account. The blogger who'd written the piece calling out John's disposability had issued a quiet retraction buried at the bottom of their site, noting that new information had come to light, and they regretted any harm caused by the original post. John's co-workers stopped giving him odd looks. His inbox, which had been flooded with angry messages from Kendra's friends and relatives, went quiet. The lawsuit limped forward for a few more months, but it was clear to everyone involved that Kendra had lost. Angela Russo filed motions to dismiss portions of the original claim, trying to salvage what she could. David responded with additional evidence, more messages, more receipts, a timeline that made it impossible to see Kendra as anything other than someone who'd made a calculated decision to weaponize the court system and lost. Finally, in mid-December, Angela reached out with a formal settlement offer. Kendra would drop her lawsuit. She'd pay a portion of John's legal fees, not all of them, but enough to acknowledge that she'd been in the wrong. And she'd sign a non-disparagement agreement, promising never to speak publicly about John again. David had called John that evening, reading the terms over the phone. "It's as good as we're going to get without going to trial," David said. "If we push this further, she'll have nothing left to give. You'll win, but there won't be anything to collect." John thought about it. Thought about dragging Kendra into a courtroom, forcing her to sit through testimony and cross-examination, watching her answer questions about the messages she'd sent and the lies she'd told. There was a part of him, a small, dark part, that wanted that. Wanted to see her squirm under oath. Wanted to hear her admit in front of a judge and jury that she'd been wrong. But there was another part, larger and quieter, that was simply tired. Tired of the legal maneuvering, the paperwork, the constant weight of unfinished business. Tired of letting Kendra Whitlow occupy space in his thoughts. "Tell them we'll accept the settlement," John said. "On one condition. The non-disparagement agreement is mutual, but if she violates it, If she says one word about me publicly, posts one cryptic message, does anything to suggest she's still playing the victim, the settlement is void and we go back to court. That's enforceable, David said. I'll draft it. The papers were signed in January, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding that hadn't been. John met David at his office to review the final documents, and when he walked out onto the cold street afterward, he felt something shift inside him. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of pressure, the way your ears pop after a plane lands. It was over. John drove to Millstone that weekend, the roads gray and slushy with late-season snow. His mother's house looked the same as it always did, small, neat, the front porch swept clean. He let himself in with the key she'd given him years ago and found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. I wasn't sure you'd make it with the weather, she said, but her smile was warm as she hugged him. They ate dinner at her small table, the same one John had done homework at as a teenager. Afterwards, she made coffee and they moved to the living room, where the old radiator hissed and clicked. It's settled, John said. The lawsuit. It's done. Janice nodded slowly, her hands wrapped around her mug. I'm glad. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes from people who've weathered storms together. Eventually, his mother spoke again. I hated that day, she said quietly. The wedding. I hated what they said, but I hate more that you had to give up something you wanted because of it. John looked at her, at the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion to give him a chance at a better life, who'd never asked for anything in return, who'd sat through insults at his wedding and hadn't said a word because she didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't give up anything I wanted, he said. I got rid of something I didn't. She smiled then, small and sad. You're a good son. I learned from a good mother. In the spring, Janice planted a small garden in her backyard. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs she'd been wanting to grow for years, but never had the time or energy to start. John came down one Saturday to help her build raised beds from cedar planks, and they worked side by side in the sun, dirt under their fingernails, the smell of fresh soil rich in the air. I might retire soon, she said, packing soil around a tomato seedling. I've been thinking about it. I've got enough saved now, and I'm tired. John looked over at her, at the gray threaded through her hair and the lines etched around her eyes. You've earned it. Maybe I'll travel. Go see your cousin in Oregon. Visit that national park you're always telling me about. Yellowstone. That one. They finished the garden beds as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and when they stood back to admire their work, John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not closure, exactly. Closure was too neat a word for the messy business of living, but something close to peace. He thought about Kendra sometimes, wondered if she'd found a new job, if she'd moved on, if she'd learned anything from what had happened. But mostly, he didn't think about her at all. She'd become a closed chapter, a cautionary tale he'd carry with him but not dwell on. Some people would call what happened karma. John wasn't sure he believed in karma. It implied a cosmic justice that seemed too tidy for the randomness of real life. But he believed in consequences, believed that actions rippled outward, that choices created futures, that the way you treated people mattered. Kendra had tried to destroy his name after disrespecting the woman who'd raised him. She'd weaponized the legal system, manipulated public opinion, painted herself as a victim while tearing him down. And in the end, she'd shown everyone exactly who she was. John had walked away with his family intact, his dignity preserved, and his conscience clear. And that, he thought, watching his mother water her new garden in the fading light, was the only thing that had ever mattered.